Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning to you, and thank you for joining our webinar, Connecting with Confidence, FHIR Client App Certification and Integration Pilot Success. My name is Lynn, and I'm the Campaign and Field Marketing Manager here at Drummond. And before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of that recording via email in the coming days. Additionally, if you have questions for our speakers throughout the webinar, you can submit them in the comment section on the right-hand side of your screen, and they will address all of your questions towards the end of the presentation. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. From Drummond, I have John Volukovich, Director of Programs, and from Centric Solutions, I have Mark Holey, Principal Software Engineer. I'm going to pass it over to Mark and John now.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate the introduction and welcome everybody. So exciting webinar we have for you today to talk about a client's recent success, the very first client we had go through a unique, first of an industry kind, FHIR Client App Certification Program. I'm John Volukovich. As Lynn mentioned, I've been with Drummond 5 years now, and I'm a 30-year veteran of the healthcare information technology industry, spending time in the EHR world, service, consulting, and storage world. And I'm happy to have with me Mark Holey from Centric Solutions. Mark, a bit about yourself, please.
Sure, thanks, John. My name is Mark Holey, Principal Software Engineer at PCS, Centric Solutions. I've been in tech for a shade over 25 years, a lot of work in the DoD space and the federal space, and most of my work was done with large data projects, decision-making applications, and securing information across various enclaves. I've come into healthcare about 3 years ago. I've been working explicitly on our FHIR work here at Centric Solutions. And I'm very excited to join this program and be the first one through the wickets. And I'm happy to speak to you guys about that today.
Great. All right, with that, we will get started. So just again, for the benefit of the audience, a bit about Drummond. A lot of you may know us from our footprints in the certification world for healthcare IT. We're fortunate to have a large market share of certified solutions as it relates to ONC and CMS, some 3,500 ONC certifications, so large and small EHRs, ambulatory, inpatient, home health, and the like. And complementing those, Drummond has a portfolio of solution sets for providers and for EHRs, developers, and health IT advocates as it relates to HIPAA assessments. We've had a lot of experience with that. It would make sense if we are in the ONC certification world to have a parallel stream with e-prescribing as it relates to EPS certifications. And then again, our Drummond got started basically with the point of care interfaces. So there's relationships there, both in the health IT and the retail world, which is really where Drummond got its start back in 1999, before becoming a software certification accredited test lab with ONC back in 2009, of which I was originally a customer. So again, we have a whole portfolio of solution sets here, inclusive of advisory services as well, complete with security software services as it relates to penetration testing and the like as well. So do encourage you at the conclusion of this webinar to follow up on our website. So with that, I'd like to give Mark an opportunity to talk a little bit about our first customer, Centric Solutions. Mark, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, John. Centric Solutions has been around for about 5 years, and we were developed from another company that has existed in the healthcare space for about 30 years. And the company was developed primarily to, well, you see our mission statement here, but the focus became around the FHIR specification and applications and implementations and solutions that leveraged FHIR and tried to move the bar forward with FHIR. So our mission, as stated here, enabling patients and providers to easily exchange data across facilities, so accurate information is available when it's needed. Obviously the title of the company, Patient-Centric, dictates the fact that we're fully interested in best care for the patient at all times, and whether that means that the provider, the patient's family, other support staff need to have access to that information we're leveraging tools and the FHIR spec to try and get that information into the hands of the people who need it when they need it. As mentioned also here on the slide, we have developed a suite of tools, some product that leverages the specification and the tooling that's built in and around FHIR, whether it be server side or through the APIs to the front end. We have, in this particular process that we work through, we use the patient share viewer, a clinical data viewer that allows access to a very broad set of patient health information. And we have a few other tools that leverage the information in other ways. The patient share exchange, as mentioned here, which is a solution. So it's more than just the viewer. The viewer sits on top of a series of other tools that allow for that data to be securely and privately moved from location to location or user to user, again, so that the proper person has the proper information at the right time to make good decisions. We also have done some other work more recently in terms of supporting community-based care organizations and some of the social determinants. So we're taking sort of a parallel track with FHIR and integrating both clinical and social information, again, in the best way to support the whole person care. And we're quite excited about that and those efforts as well. One of those particularly, as mentioned here, is the long-term services and support care plan. And we've built some tools all based on FHIR that allow the creation and the sharing of that information amongst care teams and the building and establishment and communication with those care teams. And we've also done a number of other tasking and jobs that involve the implementation of FHIR architectures, components of translation of data from legacy systems to more contemporary systems into FHIR and out of FHIR, and effectively interoperable solutions that allow us to share that information across the communities of interest. And that's about it, John. Hand it back to you.
Great, no, I appreciate it. And again, this cues up part of the conversation as we'll get to a little bit later on in this deck. It's a really robust solution, and to be the first one through the program really push the limits of our FHIR application certification program. So we're pleased with this. This was a great one I have to be the first again through the program. So let's talk a little bit about Drummond's FHIR client testing and certification program. Again, the first in the industry certification program and compliance check for the FHIR client app side of the equations. We all are probably well positioned to understand that the host data systems through API certification through ONC and CMS have had to be certified for some time now. But now we're taking a good look at the client side, and that's what this program is designed to do. So we got a lot of feedback from the Drummond perspective. First and foremost is, again, we're fortunate to have the largest EHR customer base going through certification here. So they're obviously a great resource. And what we understood going back some 18 to 24 months ago is the developer hurdles that are faced when you build and then open up an API. There's the onboarding demands. If you are a rich data source, a large-scale hospital system using a large out-of-the-box EHR, or perhaps even a smaller home health environment that's just getting connected, the demand for your data is going to be quite high to be paired with a FHIR client app that solves a useful work case in most instances. There is challenges with that. The coding of HL7 to some degree has its pits and challenges, but from a client side, the ability to stand up a client and then connect to an API is certainly one part of the story. There is the onboarding challenges with that. And again, we heard a lot from the EHR side and the payer side to a degree that the acumen on the client side did vary. There are some that are well positioned to connect immediately and go through implementations. There are others that, a lot of questions pop up when it comes to authentication and Smart on FHIR having its challenges and then navigating various US core levels. That does place a resource drain on these large scale API providers to be able to handle a myriad of requests. Again, if you have good data and you're sharing it as you should be, the requests for that data, it's a rich pipeline. Everybody wants it. And then there's just determining the variety of use cases. The EHR developers, the hospital systems, the ambulatory providers, do have a right to prioritize in terms of that patient care and provider workflow integrity, and perhaps influencing to say, well, which variety of use cases should we tackle first? So there's that triaging that, again, is a challenge for EHR, CMS payer developers, for instance, to work with everybody that wants to connect to their side. If I'm sitting on the client side, we have these conversations too, is I am often doing a repetitive process for onboarding my app through sandbox number 1 with EHRA, sandbox number 2 with EHRB, for instance, with a provider system. It is roughly the same rules of the road and engagement. Of course, you have to go through a registration process. That goes without saying. But again, all of the other sub-testing around that is likely very much the same. We have found through even determining, piloting this particular program and talking to developers on the client side, there's implementation bias, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Mark's going to speak more to this. We all know the FHIR spec is quite broad, and which elements you decide to implement beyond maybe a certain required amount can introduce implementation bias. Implementation bias in terms of maybe even some of the sub resources that aren't necessarily required or minimally coded. That does drain a small or even mid-size FHIR app client developers resources to constantly be doing the same thing. And let's face it, if I'm a FHIR client app developer and I want to connect to, well, let's just call them the big guys, for instance. Rightly so, there's a lot of requests of those large-scale developers and provider organizations to onboard. And I may be in a queue, and there's just an understandable response time issue that at current, without a program which we're talking about here, that may free up some of those challenges, is something that API developers and FHIR client app developers face. So where has Drummond positioned our FHIR client testing and certification program? If we look quickly at this graphic, this is sort of a snapshot at where the industry is today in time. So you have your FHIR client app marketplace, and I'm going to whittle that client app marketplace down from not the tens of thousands of apps that you might find in an Android or an Apple store, although there are some there, but more in line with the apps that enhance, augment, contribute to provider, patient workflows as it might relate to integrating with a large-scale hospital system, an ambulatory home health, with an EHR, and perhaps with payer environments. So that is a smaller subset, although numbering in the thousands. All of those app developers typically go through an industry validation process. And let's just call that the connectathons, whether they be sponsored by CMS or wholly HL7. Maybe it's an IHE connectathon as part of HIMSS, for instance. So you're going into these environments, scrums, for instance, between EHR developers, and you are doing some testing, and you're doing some opportunity to put your client app through the paces with some probably placebo-like sandboxes. Then, beyond that, rightly so, each one of the connection points or systems that you do want to connect with, whether it be an EHR, whether it be a payer, maybe you've gone beyond that and got listed in perhaps an app store, you then will encounter provider systems that'll want to put you through their validation before they let you on that particular network. So there's lots of evaluation steps there. We look at the Drummond role in working with and reliant on our history in healthcare IT certification going back to 2009, for instance, to be able to say, okay, we designed this FHIR client app certification program to be able to say that with Drummond's certification and going through the process, which I'll explain a little bit more in a moment, this certified seal of approval means that you've been able to demonstrate that you, the FHIR client app developer, are a good actor in terms of understanding the proper implementation guides, understanding the data sources that you're connecting to, what might be available, and then even taking it a step further. And I'll talk more about that because there is an evaluation of that product beyond just following implementation guides. So let me pause there and say that let's just set the stage for that, because I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about the Drummond program and the benefit to FHIR app developers. But through all of that, and right down to a UI evaluation, we were able to work with Centric Solutions as our first customer to complete the testing and certification process. So one of the goals of this particular presentation is for the audience to hear from themselves, from a customer who we collaborated, work side by side with, about their experience in the particular program. So Mark, what I'll do is I'll queue it up, and as you need a slide
Sure.
advanced, do let me know.
Sure, thanks. So just to begin with a little bit more background here, just to set the stage, John, as this slide indicates here, we've been involved with HL7 for many years, since as it actually predates the start of patient-centric solutions in terms of our leadership and so forth. And we've been involved in a number of different working groups. We've been involved in the standards development. We've authored some implementation guides, and we've been part of a number of the groups that are ancillary to HL7 that deal with, for example, let's say security, the Caring Alliance, the Cantera group, and so forth. So we've had a real broad experience working with a number of different approaches to the FHIR spec. And when I say that, when I say approaches, for example, the different working groups, and they all are working through different use cases. And when we get to a connectathon, for example, during a given cycle, as many of the folks online may know, there's a specific focus. And what we try to do is, from the data perspective, the teams are developing the data model in such a way that it will accommodate all the necessary information that will allow the end user to have the data available when they need it, and to make good decisions at the tail end of the process and the communication of that information across the wire. What we typically were doing as well as doing some of the assistance along the lines of, as mentioned, authoring or curating the data, we also helped with the helping to bring that, to surface that information up to the end user. And that's what the patient share client was developed for over time. So over a long period of time, this client has been developed to accommodate a really broad scope of resources in terms of FHIR and US Core, and a lot of the implementation guides that sort of work alongside that. So our app, as you mentioned earlier on, probably, blessing and a curse that it was the first one, it provided a really broad range of FHIR resources for you to investigate and verify and sort of put under the microscope. Again, as mentioned, that also created a broader start point for your program. So probably if we were a little bit, if we were slimmer in a single workflow, perhaps a medications flow or an immunizations flow or conditions, it may have shrunk the aperture down, and it might have sped things along a little bit. But I think that ultimately the fact that we had such a broad range has now allowed you and set you up well for the next 1, 2, 3, 4 that come through the gate, because probably we will have covered the resources that they will have within their application.
That's a really
again, go ahead, John.
Yeah, good point. And again, I'll echo that. And as we're going to see in a couple of minutes, the broadness of the product allowed us to really delve into the minutia as it relates to the profiles in US Core. So it was a great exercise.
Yeah, no, and I think that the other thing that was kind of exciting for us, being the first as well, was the ability that we had to see the process from the ground up, see how you guys were doing your work and how you built the program, but also to sort of have that connectathon spirit of working with your team to achieve and solve problems throughout the process. If it was, whether it was data, you mentioned the implementation bias, we can talk on that a little bit, or whether it was just the way the information was being stored within the resources and how that was surfaced up. And it may have been EHRA may put information into resources in a specific way, whereas EHRB may be just slightly different enough that we'd have to be aware of that kind of a delta and make some kind of an accommodation either at the front end or at the server end, so that everybody's kind of working on the same page. And that's not at all uncommon. As you mentioned, it's a really broad spec, and it allows, it's built to allow a broad use, and it's the hope is that it can be applied to many use cases, right? That's what FHIR is. So With that in mind, after the groups are working together with the understanding of how information is communicated, you get down to the granularity of what information is communicated and how it's effectively parked in the various resources. And once that's sort of agreed on, if there's really subtle choices that may be made in terms of how some of the information is stored, then the developer and the server, the data provider, would agree on that and surface that information up and have that all, again, as mentioned, all within the spec, but it's just how the spec is being applied to the given workflow or the given problem set. The other thing that I'll mention here on screen, we've done so many different healthcare implementations and worked with so many different servers and API developers, some more custom and some as broad as the FHIR servers that have a wider range of service. That a lot, and again, through connectathons or actual professional services, it's allowed us to sort of have a broad base of understanding of what some of the occasional, I don't want to call them problems, but sort of the occasional issues that you might run into that tend to be things they can be resolved quickly if you have an understanding of what you might bump into. And I think that that experience for us helped us as a team, Drummond and Patient Centric, to quickly get through some of the hurdles that may otherwise have been a little bit slower to get through. And I think that our belief in being agnostic to what the data provider is and trying to service them all through the spec, because once they're adhering to the spec, of course, then it's a common model, right? So if it's a common model, we should be able to effectively throw largely the same query at any server or API that's been built to that spec and have an understanding of what we're going to receive back. So that I think that background sort of helped us to develop this our tool, but also this knowledge base that kind of helped us to move the program and your program to the goal line perhaps a little more quickly than otherwise. The other thing that I'll mention, just to circle back, is all of that work that we've done with all of the working groups over time and these implementations has given us the broad set of resources, as mentioned. We'll see that on a couple of screens here just to follow. But and in fact, why don't maybe we can actually toggle on to the next one and talk to it, John, as we go. It might be just a little bit easier to sort of. So, for example, the workflow here, this is very much like the view that an EHR may present to sort of a summary view of information for a given patient. And this particular view has, I was looking at it earlier, and I think although we see 7 boxes effectively, there's the combination of 9 or 10 different resources at the macro level parked into this view here. And what that does, so we have, as I mentioned earlier, if we were just let's say an app that was for a pharmacy-based app that was pulling demographic information and medications, perhaps, maybe it would have problem lists associated with those. So that may be 3 or 4, whereas our app has what you see here, plus a whole series of others. And if we toggle on to the next one, you'll see this is, again, for example, on the left-hand bar here, you see some of the others that are here. And these are mostly the core elements, with a couple of others that we were able to approach during some of our connectathon work with the PASSIO group, particularly in the transitions of care. And for example, we did a great deal of work around care teams and care planning. Here is there's a care plan there, and this is a really comprehensive care plan. This is the long-term service and support care plan, which actually brings together 56 different data elements underneath through the FHIR spec, underneath the care plan, and represent these things to page in a logical way. And all of the work that we've ever done in these connectathons, the thing that makes it exciting for us is that we typically, always have stakeholders involved, and these stakeholders are professionals in the field that are contributing the information of how they would use the information. So the information then, not only does it get surfaced to the page, but then it's rearranged on the page in a way that it allows them to answer the questions that they need to answer for the patient or the consumer at the time that they need it. So These last few slides really was just intended, John, just to show us kind of the range of all of those different resources that we were able to address.
Right. And I think, Mark, what that does is a couple of things. It really brings up the next section that'll be particularly interesting, I think, if I'm an API developer or if I am an API host, clients, whatever the use case may be on the side of the API world, to say, given the breadth of, we hit every US Core 4 resource as part of evaluating your particular client. So there's flexibility in terms of our program, in terms of what US Core resources you might support, for instance, or, Mark, as you alluded to, and I'd like to get into it in some of these segments here, we'll call it implementation bias. And bias necessarily is not, a bad thing. It's determining, and the FHIR spec is so broad, right? And the use cases that an API provider might support or what an API client might ask for are going to dictate a lot of what becomes available. And I think, Mark, in our conversations yesterday, rightly so, as a client that's knocking on the door of the API, you are reliant at a high degree, obviously, to ask a lot of questions, but you're only going to get back what's available. And the bar is set at a certain level through ONC certification to the G10 criteria, for instance, which is also used on the CMS payer side as well, in terms of making what data should be available and how. But there are, when you go through the US Core and US CDI specifications all the way up through 6.1, for instance, additional elements and sub-elements that get put in there. So what I'd like to do is, if we could, Mark, given the breadth and the client base here has seen what's made available and the robustness of the PCI Patient Share app, if we could tick off a couple of these boxes, and just for preparing customers that may come into the Drummond program about your experiences. If you could talk through a couple of these, and I'll slide in and add a little color here and there.
Yeah, for sure. So the very first box we have here, talking about the validation of adherence to the specification, the question that prompted this statement was effectively, what interested us in a Drummond certification? Why did we go and seek that out? And from our perspective as members of the FHIR community, and as I mentioned, we've done a lot of work on the security side of the FHIR spec, and in testing and in collaborating with some of the other folks who deal with identity, authentication, authorization, to try and make sure that we and those who are participating in the FHIR community are good stewards of the information, right? Good stewards of the data, and keeping it private and allowing the right people to have access to the information when that authorization has been assigned and allowed by the patient. Knowing that and I'll say this to the developers that may be online, the first part of our interactions before we ever got to data was, how is this app performing in terms of securing the exchange, securing the authorization, the token management, our use of OAuth 2, and I appreciated Drummond's very discreet review of all of those exchange elements, and is it being done properly from the perspective of the client and API handshake and conversation. So particularly when that was made aware, then we were very confident and comfortable with the fact that this will allow anybody who has this certification to be viewed as, and those who are receiving it, to know that their application has met the bar for adhering to the specification in the proper way. And again, we talked about, and that's everything before we get to the UI. That's just us being in the playground and properly communicating with proper security and proper authentication authorization. Then the second phase of our project was, okay, now we've made that handshake and we know that you are validated, verified, and authorized to get at this information through these queries. Now we're pulling data back, and how are you going to surface up that data? So that whole second phase was where our background of having done work with a real range of resources allowed you guys at the program to really hit that requirement of addressing all of these different resources across that whole scope of US Core and well beyond, because many of the implementation guides that we've worked on use a lot of the support resources that build the information in and around those US Core elements. So that's sort of box one and box two. To get to the implementation bias mention that we talked on earlier, one of the things that we realized obviously is that some of these servers that had been received their certification stood up with the purpose, for example, of servicing payers or some workflow like that might be more oriented around the claim and financial side of the clinical space, maybe didn't have all of the same needs and requirements as a more purely clinical application would, or to stretch that even further, an application that may address some of the more whole person care, which are more in the social needs spectrum. So if we go further outside of that, of the fiscal requirements, you wind up having a real requirement to look closely at how the information is being pushed across the wire. And when I say that, I mean, it may be that various sub-elements for a claim, let's use that, which carries a real robust data set, may be required for, a payment workflow, A, B, C, D, and E, all required. It could be that for something on the side of like a care plan, for example, may leverage a claim that ultimately is just leveraging just one element of costing to add, a little bit of detail into a service that is intended to be provided to meet the need of a person who has a long-term goal of, better healthcare or better movement, improving their physical movement over time through physical therapy or something of that nature. So it might not require every piece of information, but it may require one discrete piece of information, and knowing that it's in the proper place or how it's been coded into the resource is always, that's that implementation bias. What elements and sub-elements of the resource are being leveraged to communicate that information, because some folks in different workflows may leverage different parts of a given resource. An implementation guide tends to focus the needs of all of those, the use of those various resources, and particularly the data elements underneath it. So that's sort of how you get the view of the data elements and what parts are going to be used. But not every server is going to entertain every implementation guide, and that's where we see some of that bias happen. When you have a server that is built to handle a given implementation guide, and others that may have been certified to meet other needs, which is perfectly fine. It's a broad spec. That's where we sometimes see that implementation bias, and it causes. It doesn't cause a problem, but it causes the need to address and perhaps enhance either a server or an application to accommodate those kinds of differences.
And maybe, Mark, that's where I'll just jump in and we can maybe expand on an example, for instance. So we'll harken back to when the program was initially developed. Obviously, we use a variety of servers in our program. We're fortunate to have a MELDRX and interoperability server as part of our environment here. We hope to expand that over time. Good partners. Obviously, any server that is part of the environments here has gone through ONC certification and even CMS badge certification. We'll reference G10. And again, one of the fastest ways and efficient ways to test that, obviously, is through the Inferno test tool. But through the collaboration that we had, and I'll call this implementation bias, yet in a good way, is maybe, Mark, you could talk a little bit about that. Given the breadth of information that Patient-Centric Solutions Patient Share app offers on, let's just pick on medications, for instance. So there's a bar that's drawn that, well, medication requests is part of the initial implementation guide referenced in the standard. That's part of G10 certification, but your solution typically needs to provide the utmost information to a patient or provider and needs to do more than just medication requests, for instance. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the application that was actually, if we don't have to go back, but the block that we had that was medication on screen in that summary is actually pulling it's pulling the medication statement, it's pulling the medication dispense, it's pulling the medication request. So it's a combination of a number of different medication resource types, and they're being pulled together. And then subsequent to that, what the app is doing in its query structure is it's using some include statements that are pulling additional resources that would be referenced logically underneath those various medication resource types to create a broader view. So if we were to go, we don't have it here, but if we were live and we were to click on the details button there on the medications block, it would open up a more detailed view of medications, and each of the medications could then be expanded. And underneath each medication, you would wind up with information around the encounter, around the prescriber, perhaps the condition that it was meant to treat, and dates around when the medication is intended to begin and end, perhaps, and things along the lines of the instructions associated with the medication, how much to take when and what regularity, what refills are available. All that's discrete information, which may not all be included in the request. The request, for example, is typically would be used when the medication is originally prescribed and it's submitted into the system. There's a request to add this medication for the patient's profile, but it doesn't necessarily include information if medication was dispensed in the hospital, or if there's a broader medication statement which includes perhaps some of this additional information and references to these other resources that might provide just a broader view on an individual medication. Does that make sense? Does that cover what we're talking about?
It does. Yeah, I think a focus and what a developer might get out of this, if I'm on the API side, is the availability of include statements and how I might have a lenient versus a stringent implementation, although within confines of the implementation guide, typically a step beyond your base G10 certification. And if I'm a FHIR client app developer, my asks of whether it's US core 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, for instance, understanding that the availability on the API side is going to be determined about how far the implementation guide is taken, whether it's over and above any of the base standards. So yeah, that was a good process for us. And again, we're fortunate to have a couple of good service providers here. This is not a one and done certification program, which I'll mention a little bit later on in this slide deck. But good. I'll kick off with collaboration in terms of our ability, Mark, given again the immense amount of data that your FHIR client asks of an API server, really tested our servers to the limit, and there were some modifications we made throughout the pilot process such that we are more than prepared, as are our service providers, for the next group of applications that are in the program now and to come. So maybe if you don't mind, I'll leave you with collaboration and your thoughts on any competitive advantage before we get into some next steps and a few other items.
Sure. Well, I think the competitive advantage, as I sort of mentioned almost in the first bullet above, is once you're through the program and you're certified that you're actually doing business properly, which is that first portion of the program, which is that we're doing and adhering to the requirements of security and information protection and so forth. And then the second piece, of course, is that more subjective view of how we're providing information back. Is this a useful presentation of information to the decision maker, right? And to me, that says that once it's a professional set of eyes looking over your application in those two ways, particularly to make sure that you're a good actor in the FHIR community in terms of trying to help move the bar forward and help that information get shared to to the folks who need it most and most quickly. And so that's where I see that advantage. You know, folks may see that we have that Drummond certification, and then they'll understand, after understanding the program, that okay, this app is doing business the right way, and they're good stewards of the data that we're handing across the wire to them. So I think that's where I see that competitive advantage, I would say.
Great.
Sure.
Let's proceed a little bit here, Mark, and I'll start with you in terms of maybe putting a bow on lessons learned and where PCS is in terms of next steps and what you look forward to. I'll mention a few things from Drummond after you
Sure.
do.
Yeah, sure. So I would say lessons learned, probably the most significant, and it was sort of emphasizing the lesson that we sort of have experienced, is that working with anyone in interoperability is we can get very close to being able to have a push button get banana type situation, but there's almost always the requirement for you to still go just a little bit further and make sure that you're getting proper information, and perhaps doing a solid handshake type interaction with the provider so that you're working with them. Interoperability that intends to suggest working together, and I think there's always going to be a little bit of that collaboration. It's particularly when you're developing these sort of leading edge and new programs, you're going to have to work this forward until we get to the point where it's all streamlined. And what's happening, I think, with your program here is it's helping to smooth the road, right? It's helping to move us forward and streamline things. So I would say the lesson learned, though, is still to be ready and to be expecting the fact that the information that's coming from an API is still going to require you to have a good hard look at it. You have to make sure that you're treating the information properly and presenting to page what you're expecting to be presenting to page. Yeah, I'd say that's probably our biggest lesson learned. I think is that there's collaboration is of utmost importance in the interoperability space. That's effectively almost a synonym for.
Great. Yeah, good perspective, Mark. And again, from my experience.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, I didn't know if you wanted me to go on to the next steps, but if you want to do a lesson learned or whatever you had on your end, that would be
real quick. The idea here is, from a Drummond perspective, obviously we started with our reliance and looking at compliance. Well, where is the bar set today in time? Okay, so from a compliance perspective, it's very clear, Mark, you did a great job of explaining the authentication piece, and it can be somewhat complicated. You can't do any of that. Obviously, you're not even going to get into the box. And then from that is the lessons learned that depending on the app environment is varied. Lots of use cases, lots of competing apps, and from a perspective of saying that, well, if I just stand up an API to a set of compliance standards, I'll reference ONCG 10, for instance. Certainly meets the minimum, gets you ready to share data. But our opportunity to really try on the EHR hat, we're hosting data as if we were an EHR or a payer system, and setting up those US core profiles and building out those robust patient profiles to entertain apps as yourself was part of the big lift. So it felt a lot like a connect-a-thon working with you throughout, and there's obviously little discoveries here and there. So appreciate that. So what's next for patient-centric solutions, Mark?
Sure. So I would say that a couple of things just to kind of bring to light. Our continued work in connect-a-thons in the HL7 space kind of allows us to always be moving the app forward. We're always developing, additional resources, additional implementation guides that are combining resources in the best way possible to solve problems for folks in the space. Recently, we've taken the app and we've moved it to more of this whole person care, which is really pretty exciting, and we're excited to go into that space with the certification so that folks can realize that this application has met the bar clinically in terms of the data sharing requirements and as I mentioned, the stewardship of information. We're moving to sort of the social service space and social determinant space, and leveraging FHIR and everything that it has to offer to do things that are allowing some of these organizations that perhaps don't have the same types of infrastructure that a hospital system or a large EHR system may have, and use FHIR to get that information across to these folks so that they can take care of the patient and the person in a better way. We're working with innovative organizations to do some of these pilots that are allowing us to exercise a lot of these features that we see in some of the connectathons and the events, whether they're CMS or HL7, and sort of leaning forward in terms of this information sharing, and that's quite exciting for us. We're large proponents of patients having information and control of their own information, and that's one of the things that we've since the very beginning been pushing as one of our underlying themes, and that's as mentioned quite early on, the exchange solution, which allows the patient to apply digital consent to their information and have that information shared with whom they choose to share it with, whether it's family or another doctor, and have that information at the ready when they make a move, for example, through a transition of care. That's one of the work use cases we did with Passio, which is a really strong case for the movement of FHIR data from any facility to facility, so that the person is arriving with their health and or social information, depending on who's servicing the patient. So we've done recently. We're in the midst of work in Missouri, which is really exciting, and that involves the long-term service and support care plan that we saw, and that work is helping to serve the Department of Mental Health in Missouri, and that's really innovative work. It's first of its kind in the country, and we're actually distributing that information from the state out through the HINs that are in place out in Missouri, and that information is going to then ultimately wind up in the service providers' hands in a digital manner, rather than in some of them in the previously existing methods that were used. So we're really excited about moving that forward. We're always looking to try to innovate and push things forward, and we've actually done quite a bit of work with in the last year or so, working with a few EHRs in terms of helping to streamline their FHIR EMR launch, for example. So not every one of the players has that quite as far downstream as some of the other players do, the smaller ones, and we've had some good success helping folks get that part of their program stood up. I'll just quickly mention one really neat program piece that we did with an HIE. And the HIE it has combined information for a patient, and the EHR could then use a smart app launch, a EHR launch, to go to the HIE and pull the combined records of the patient back into their EHR, which is actually only their view of the patient, and so they could supplement that information with the full view from 4 or 5 different providers right within their EHR. So that was really, it's kind of those, using innovative ways of thinking about using FHIR to pull information to give the broadest view that anyone needs at any one time. So those are the kind of things we're working on, and we're happy that with this certification, it should allow folks who are indecisive perhaps about which app they may choose to use. They know that they have your stamp on top of that. So, okay, this is definitely meeting, as you mentioned in your Venn diagram, it's meeting bar 1, 2, 3, and now bar 4, which is the most stringent of the bars. So I think that's something that we're happy to have, and glad to be first to market with that. It's pretty cool, pretty exciting.
Great. Yeah, appreciate that, Mark. And I know from years of supporting interfaces, specifically around transitions of care, a use case like that with a health information exchange to be able to harmonize data and bring it to a single view is huge, because that's again a good business case for an HIE and from an EHR provider. Sure. So let me just bring it home here with this particular slide, just to remind the audience again as we look at this first of the kind FHIR client app certification program. So out of the gate, as Mark had said and we touted early on, is it's conformance. It is quality assurance that your FHIR app client is following the implementation guides. And we do put that assurance and build it into not only a good look at the implementation guides and going through, as I said earlier, multiple certification steps. You're not one and done. We use multiple servers, again, different patients, depending on your use case, to ensure that more of like a real world testing environment, that your app is using different implementations. Of course, they're certified underneath the hood as they all should be, but there's information and there's testing that goes along with that. It's also rigorous, and as Mark has found out, and really what took us a good amount of time is, given the breadth of the application that would come through the program, is we are prepared to pick through every US core resource and sub-resources, include statements as well, to determine that if you say your app is configured to retrieve and display the following resources and profiles, we're going to make you do it across multiple servers. And we have a long history, again, referencing back to early meaningful use in CCDA, transitions of care, for looking at the reconciliation side to be able to determine that you're putting medications in the right place, allergies in the proper place. If you say you do absorb care plans, where do you absorb them and what do they look like? So it's a very robust and rigorous program. What that does, as Mark alluded to also, is it's going to build trust in your client app. There is the implementation guide. There is testing within your own sandbox, testing with others, and connectathons, which are all good exercises. Now take it a step further. From a third party in Drummond that specializes and is nationally known and internationally known as a certification healthcare compliance agency. So that should increase your confidence as you go to deploy your FHIR client app in different API environments. And again, I'll look back to my storied career in interoperability, haven't given it up yet, that it's always a matter of an interoperability. It does some comes down to fingerprinting. Well, it must be your side. No, it's probably your side. And if you're able to come to the table with, I've gone through a Drummond program. I have this seal of certification that ensures that I connect securely, safely, and I'm a good actor with the data I retrieve. It allows you to get through those issues should you encounter them a little bit easier. We also have heard from our EHR and our payer community, and even the FHIR app developer community, that the Drummond seal of approval, as you most know, does mean something. So if I have a triage of apps that I'm working with, the assumption will be, rightly so, that having Drummond certification allows your application to be brought to the table in the right manner, especially if you're a smaller shop, for instance. The opportunity to be able to come through what is really a low-cost certification program, I can talk more about that offline, and create efficiency. So we're looking at, for app developers and for EHR developers, there's efficiencies in knowing that a client app that is connected in an app store is worth what it actually said. There's implementation bias. We discovered that as well, and the opportunity to be able to sort through that and say that while you still might be required to go through a certification with a particular provider group or perhaps even an EHR sandbox, you're well prepared to entertain perhaps that there's additional include statements. And it will give you a competitive advantage. As Mark noted, there are a myriad of app listings, those both that are publicly available and those that are behind closed doors. And if you've had any familiarity with looking at those app listings, especially as they relate to the larger providers of solutions, whether they be payer or providers, there is competition. If you have a patient-based app, if you have a provider-based app, I'll put on a registration app, there's more than one opportunity and more than one product out there. So to have the ability to have the Drummond symbol next to it does mean a lot. We're working with organizations to include those Drummond symbols in their sandboxes, in addition to integrating systems that they might have. So again, that's a good summary of what we're looking at. If you were to proceed forward, I just recommend this, and Mark and I will then entertain in the last few minutes a little bit of Q&A. From a Drummond perspective, feel free to use the code that you see there. You'll be connected with me and my team. We are offering, as we've done at HIMSS and we've got Vibe going forward, if you have an app and you want to go through and give it a quick free app health check and to test against one of our sandboxes, we certainly would welcome you to do that prior to onboarding into our certification. As Mark had stated, a lot of experience with HL7, 2X, 3X, FHIR, going through connectathons, helping author implementation guides. We were lucky to have Patient-Centric Solutions as our first vendor. Do your homework in terms of preparing to come to either a program or on board in a sandbox that might be offered by a player or an EHR or other rich data sources. And finally, down below there is registration. So again, do encourage anybody here or viewing the recording to engage with me directly on this particular program. So let's do this. What we'll do, Mark, is with transition, we have a couple of minutes left here. I'd like to entertain a little bit of Q&A. I have been keeping an eye on a couple of the questions here, and there are questions out there for you and for me. Let me just start with one that's directed at you, Mark. Again, Jim, thank you for the question.
Sure.
Jim has asking, Mark, is the patient share app intended for patients or providers or a combination thereof?
Good question. So it's the application is intended to be used by either, and it's a configurable application, and we've built it in such a way that for example, the available resources in our left nav can be pared down to just 2 or 3 if that's what you're dealing with, or it can be widened to a more significant number if you're interested to see a broader range. I had mentioned earlier the concept of the patient-mediated exchange. That portion of that solution that we offer, that's intended for patients and their caregivers. If we think of an aging person who has a child who is their guardian, perhaps, the guardian could be supplied with the consent to have that information. Or a new doctor, if someone is moving to a new doctor, or even a physical therapist or somebody who's another supporting person, the patient would use that view and they would provide that to whom they choose. The example that I provided earlier about the HIE would be more provider focused. A provider would be in an application and might need to have a broader look at a new patient who has seen providers that are within the HIE, but not within in their locality, for example, and they would be able to use the app to reach out to the HIE and pull that information back into the EHR. So there's various use cases where it may be used by several different people. The last one I'll mention is we did a really neat pilot in Florida where we were dealing with more of a social care situation. It was a youth who was in some trouble with mental health issues and behavioral health issues, and they needed to have a support team that included a school psychologist, a primary care, a care manager, a foster parent. All of these folks had to be pulled in and have the information then shared out. So in that regard, it allowed a solid view of this person's record by all parties who were in need to see in a need to know situation. And the application that we have also allows one to then revoke that if their time is done and they don't need to see the information anymore, so that you can pull that back. So it's got a pretty a wide range of uses in terms of who the end user may be actually viewing that.
Great. Got a couple more here. There was one directed at me. If my app is already in an app store, what are the benefits, or why would I want to go through certification? And again, that does speak to the value prop, and it's a valid question to ask. So if you're in one app store, another app store, you're probably gunning for multiple app stores over time. So there is, as we talked a little bit about earlier, economies of scale in terms of the EHRs know us, the payers know us. So your ability to, especially if you're an unknown app, to come to the table and have gone through certification to prove you're a good actor is certainly part of that competitive advantage. Also is we're configured beyond the base level of G10. So the ability for your application to entertain connecting to across our multiple servers in our environment harkens to a real world testing environment. You're competing. Let's face it, your app is probably going to be used in more than one provider, ambulatory, home health, or payer organization. So you have competition there with your app, and you can help your use case by getting certified. And I'll say this, and happy to talk about this offline with anybody that would like to be entertained, is it's relatively inexpensive for an unbiased party evaluation, to have that stamp of approval that beyond the implementation guides, here's one of the important things that doesn't necessarily happen at the Connect-a-thons or any of the types of sandbox opportunities you might be working through, is this: we are taking an unbiased look also at your UI. It's required. So to determine that I have an implementation guide, I can read back in data elements and put it in my app. Well, where do you put it in the app? How do you put it in the app? Is there a workflow to that? So we'd like to leverage that, and it's a good hard look. So that seal of approval means something. I will say this: we are at the top of the hour. There are additional Q&A questions that we want to get to. We will post these with the recording as it relates to test server configurations. We're fortunate to have two good partners here. Whether it's difficult Mark's app to install, a bit more about that, what they do with social determinants of health, among others. So I do want to thank the audience for taking time out of your Thursday to join us here at Drummond. Again, thank you, Mark. Great partner. Look forward to working with you forward. And
Sure.
we'll wish everybody a nice Thursday afternoon.
Thanks, John.